Hello and welcome back to Colonial Outcasts. We are kicking off this week with a hot story right now. Ukraine has taken the Russian military unawares and launched a massive spear thrust invasion into northern Kursk in the border of northern Ukraine. I don't know. That's the headlines that we're seeing coming from the corporate Western media that has been misreporting the war from the start. So Ukraine invades Russia. Was it a masterstroke or a strategic blunder? Which one is it? Spoiler alert, it's not looking like the best operation. So today, I've got myself on this episode, Greg Stoker, former United States Army Ranger. I now do geopolitical analysis and stuff, also in Mint Press. And I did cover this last night on Mint Press, but here on Colonial Outcast, I am not bound by the editorial requirements of a news organization. So we're just going to get into it. Alina Xenofontos is also here coming to us from Cyprus, and we are going to talk about what the actual F is going on with this military operation. And I'm going to contextualize in case you guys aren't really tracking what's going on, and then we're just going to dive right in. Alina, thank you so much for joining us yet again.
Yeah, it's always good to be on.
So when I talk about like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I kind of sometimes hate reporting on it, the subject, because I'm totally baffled that I get called a tanky, which to me is absurd. Do you know the term tanky?
No, I don't. Please inform me. I don't know that term.
Okay, so a tanky is basically an anarchist circle term for authoritarian communists. It's basically like people who support the USSR sending tanks into Budapest during the Hungarian uprising. So I don't know. That's just something I
So
get
they call
called.
them tankies. Okay, I wasn't aware of that terminology. No, I wasn't aware. So you get called a tanky. That's an interesting one.
But by some people, just because I'm critical of the war, and I just want to let you guys know that I am wholeheartedly against authoritarianism, whether it is left wing or right wing, but our government's dirty work is underrepresented in the media. So that's what I focus on. And that's kind of like what Colonial Outcast does as an anti-imperialist podcast, where generally US and UK citizens, we can pressure our government and be critical of our government, but we can't really affect what Russia's doing. Anyways, regardless, it's a war that never needed to happen. And we can get into that a little bit later, but today, we're just kind of focusing on this extraordinarily brazen military operation that I'm just going to get into right now. So, if you think that, first of all, if you think that this is going to turn out well, I will just kind of posit the question that if you think that 2 to 3 understrength brigades, Ukrainian brigades with stretched supply lines, can take and hold Russian ground into the winter months, and the ceasefire negotiation season, I don't know. Maybe we can convince you that by the end of this, that's not something that's actually sustainable. So in case you guys aren't tracking, 7 days ago, the Ukrainian Army, the AFU, the Armed Forces of Ukraine, initiated a surprise counteroffensive into the Russian region of Kursk along the northern border of Ukraine, and initially captured over 350 square kilometers of territory in what is the largest regional gain since the Kharkiv offensive nearly 2 years ago. So they've captured now more. So that was the initial estimate. They've captured more than 350 square kilometers. Some estimates are up to 850. But this armed forces of Ukraine's first offensive into Russia's soil has apparently caught the Russian military unawares. Yeah, I mean, it did. Also, it's not something you would expect because it doesn't make a lot of sense militarily or strategically. However, the salient question remains, what are the goals of this brazen offensive? And now, after 7 days of observation, it's becoming clear that the battle for Kursk could either end in a significant strategic victory that improves Kiev's negotiating position in the stalled peace talks. Probably not. Or a grave blunder that diverts men and material away from the fighting against the steady Russian territorial gains in the south. So the Donbass is, after all, or Donetsk region is, after all, more valuable than the Kursk region. And now Belgorod region is now which is also in Russia, is now having some border towns being evacuated due to the fighting in Kursk. So hint, hint, this is going to be a blunder, but the CIA talking points are hard at work. So anyways, we're thinking the likely goals of this operation, because the Ukrainian military has been pretty tight-lipped about this, are: one, to stall the Russian initiative and territorial gains it has made since the start of 2024. Two, to win a much-needed public relations victory and focus on a more positive narrative for Ukraine in light of Russian victory. So if you guys aren't tracking the conflict, Russia has been steadily gaining ground, slowly through a grinding war of high-intensity attrition, gaining ground in Ukraine and the eastern Ukraine region. It's been defeat headline after defeat headline, withdrawal headline after withdrawal headline. So this will be important for both the demoralized population of Ukraine, the military, and the Western politicians who have become leery, wary, unenthusiastic of funding a losing, apparently never-ending proxy war. So that's the second goal. A third goal, and this is one that Putin himself mentioned, and we'll play a clip of that in a minute, is to capture and hold as much territory as is militarily viable in order to strengthen Ukraine's diplomatic leverage in the event of a resumed peace talk or a negotiated settlement. Because the Ukrainian military cannot retake ground that Russia now occupies in eastern Ukraine. They are hoping to gain Russian territory that they can barter or bargain with. So this is something that's behind the operation. And four is to improve its leverage with the European Union by capturing the Sudza gas metering station that pumps nearly 50% of all Russian gas exports to the EU since the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. It's possible that Ukraine may threaten to turn the gas flow off in order to silence vocal critics of the war, like Hungary, which has vetoed several aid packages in the EU Parliament in Brussels to send military support to Ukraine. But either way, it's clear that Ukraine, already experiencing a military-wide manpower shortage, has committed significant resources and assets to this assault, including two of its best equipped and fastest fighting brigades, the 22nd Mechanized Brigade and the 80th Air Assault Brigade. What at first looked like a typical lightning raid meant to embarrass Russian military leaders now appears to be a larger operation. So the armed forces of Ukraine will now try to hold ground in order to shift Russian force dispositions away from the Donetsk region and go for a larger, much-needed PR victory. So President Putin, as you guys may recall, and Foreign Minister Lavrov have reiterated several times during the failed peace summit last June, or this past June, that Russia is open to a ceasefire deal, but Kiev will have to take into account, quote, the realities on the ground, implying that Ukraine would have to cede territory controlled by the Russian military. By holding territory in Kursk, Kiev, the Ukrainian government hopes to flip the script, seeing that President Zelensky said last week on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, that, quote, our unwavering goal is to prepare a real foundation for a just end to this war already this year, and it's possible, unquote. So if this is truly the main goal of the offensive into Russia, it looks more like a massive long-term blunder, since there's little chance the Ukrainian army can hold Russian ground into the autumn months with manpower and supply line shortages, and a loss of territorial gains will undermine any short-term PR victories that they have. You know, Alina, this kind of reminds me of the Israeli hostage rescue operation in Gaza, where, you know, they massacred a bunch of people, they rescued 4 hostages, potentially killed 3 more, and then it was this really short-lived PR victory, because then they realized, oh crap, all the hostages are getting moved back into the tunnels, and we're never going to recover them again. So I'm kind of getting short-term PR gains, and not really any strategic goals are going to end up being actualized or realized by this. I don't know what your initial opinion is.
Yeah, 100%. I 100% agree with you. The worst part about all this is that in the long run, it's going to be catastrophic for Ukraine militarily, because the units that essentially were removed from Donbass in order to make this like this incursion into Kursk are some of their last strongest battle tested, let's just say, units that they have now removed from the Donbass region, which is the most sort of a tested region, and they've basically sent them into Kursk. And the fact of the matter is, the idea behind this as well, like you already say to this point, was that um, it's supposed to coerce the Russian military to have to mobilize and remove some of their soldiers from the front lines, from the line of contact, and essentially send them over to Kursk. But this is the thing, in terms of the Russian military, they have the manpower. I mean, every couple of months, they're able sort of to recuperate their soldiers, bring in reservists, move them around. They have the manpower to be able to essentially bring in soldiers into the Kursk region and sort of deal with this Ukrainian incursion without actually having to move anybody on their own front lines. So this idea that they've just moved, like the Ukrainians have just taken some of their strongest that are left, because this is the other thing. We shouldn't forget that Ukraine is struggling severely when it comes to manpower. I mean, even in Western media, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, even in just the last couple of months, they've been systematically reporting on the fact that Ukraine is severely suffering from manpower. Many Ukrainians were killed specifically following the huge counteroffensive that was supposed to take place last spring, the spring offensive that then became a summer offensive. It was a huge blow to the Ukrainian military, and it was a huge blow to the Ukrainian morale. And that's actually, in fact, why in the last couple of months in the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, they actually have been trying to pass a piece of legislation that would have allowed the Ukrainian conscription age to go from 27 to 25, because they have such short supply of manpower. But the reason it hasn't passed through the Rada is because it's so unpopular, because so many Ukrainians no longer want to go and fight, which is leading to all these scenes that we've been seeing with the sort of forceful conscriptions and the checkpoints that are being set up, and the sort of the abduction, essentially at this point, of Ukrainians to put them into the military. So this idea that they've just sent in some of their last strongest units into Kursk, which sooner or later Russia's going to take a control over, because they're going to be able to sort of mobilize around it, with the intention that it's going to expand the Russian army to coerce them to move and basically remove some of their soldiers from the front lines into Kursk. It's not going to work. And in fact, I'm just going to say this has already happened. They've done something like this, but not the official Ukrainian military, back in 2023, May 2023, last year, in Volograd. I'm not sure if I'm.
My Slavic pronunciation is horrendous. So,
and the thing is, with Russian, sometimes it's spelled with an O, but I know the O is pronounced with an A depending on certain words. So I'm not sure, because I know it's spelled with an O, but it could be pronounced as an A. Forgive me, I ask any Russian speakers, apologies in advance. But in Belgrade last year, May of last year, there was another incursion. And again, we have to remind people, Kursk and Belgrade are Russian territories within what is internationally recognized as the Russian Federation. So these territories are part of Russia. And there was another incursion last year. But last year, the incursion was actually from what was labeled as independent militias or resistance movements that had nothing to do with the Ukrainian state. And the Ukrainian state has said that it has nothing to do with our army. It was an independent mobilization, even though in actuality, those militias or these resistance movements had all the US equipment that was provided to Ukraine when they did the incursion. And again, the idea, I remember at the time, was again to stretch the Russian army thin. And I even remember the reports that were coming out again in Western mainstream media that had said that essentially that failed, because what it did, again, it was something similar along to what we're seeing, although obviously this particular incursion was a bit more successful, but that has to do with geography, which I'll get to in about a second. But it didn't succeed because none of the military of the Russian military that was in the front lines or in the line of contact were mobilized at all. They just brought in the reservists, and the issue was dealt with without having to change in any way the Russian structure within Ukraine. And the last point I was going to make is, because we're speaking about the fact that they were able to make quite a lot of gains within the Russian territory. I was actually taking a look at the map, and what was interesting is that a lot of the roads that they took were just sort of these straight, open-ended roads, which is why it allowed them, and they were not very well militarily sort of protected. It was sort of one of the more abandoned areas, let's say, which I guess, it took Russians by surprise. For that reason, they didn't kind of have the security in that region, which is obviously why they made that incursion, why it was easier to make that incursion. And that's why they were also able to make sort of the kind of gains that they did. But it's not going to be long lasting. And this is the point, that they're about to use up their resources, their last good men, on an incursion that's not going to be long-term sustainable. And in the end, it's going to boomerang into a negative for them, because they needed all the manpower they can get in the Donbass, and they're now risking losing that.
Right. And it does take time to mobilize troops and manpower and to come up with an effective counter-offensive strategy. But it now seems that Russia has done that. Took about a week. That's not an unreasonable amount of time. So according to Reuters, just breaking now, Russian forces on Tuesday, being today, struck back at Ukrainian troops with missiles, drones, airstrikes, and actions that one senior commander said had halted Ukraine's advance after the biggest attack on sovereign Russian territory since the war began. So Ukrainian forces are said to have carved out a slice of Russian territory, prompting Moscow to evacuate almost 200,000 people while it rushed in reserves. Russian forces have destroyed, this is state media, a total of 35 Ukrainian tanks, significant, 31 armored personnel carriers, significant, 18 infantry fighting vehicles, and 179 other armored vehicles during the week-long battle. I don't trust Russian figures, and I definitely don't trust Ukrainian figures, but a lot of assets, men, and material have been lost already in this assault. And as you said earlier, while Ukraine are using goon squads to recruit people and trying to get people's visa in other countries revoked so they have to come back and fight, Russia is able to, because its economy is kind of in an upturn, to put mildly, able to expand military benefits, payment incentives to soldiers for recruitment purposes. It's completely not symmetrical, the same logistical problems that they had. So looking at Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels, what we're seeing right now is one of the big gains, or one of the big, points of this operation seems to be to capture key civilian infrastructure. So you have the Sudza gas metering station, which controls Russian gas to Europe, also gives apparently Ukraine $1 billion in transit fees a year, according to BNA IntelliNews. And they also wanted to capture the nuclear power plant that's also in the region. Okay, because as you may recall, if you've been following this for a while, that Russia controls a Ukrainian power plant. If they control a Russian nuclear power plant, that's another bargaining chip. So a lot of people in these Telegram channels, I'm speaking of pro-Ukrainian Telegram channels, are saying this maneuver has many advantages, but the main one is obtaining a stronger position for the upcoming negotiations that everybody's talking about. Yeah, we've already covered that. And, quote, the cherry on top is the nuclear power plant in the city of Kurchatov, to which Ukrainians have less than 50 kilometers left to capture it. Well, it does seem, based off of not so conflicting reports in both Telegram channels, which is where actually we get a lot of the information about what's actually happening on the ground in the war, just like we do in Israel and Palestine. It seems like their advance towards the power plant has also been stymied they are contained. The Ukrainian forces are contained. While they do control Sudza, the entire settlement, they're contained and they're actively fighting back. It doesn't seem sustainable. They don't have time to do things like entrench, build entrench trench works, have defense in depth. They're basically just having fighting vehicles and covered in concealed positions. And it seems inevitable that they are going to get rolled up and be repelled back. And yeah. But,
No, I agree.
I did. Oh, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, finish your point.
But I just wanted to look at what some of these Telegram channels put forward, just kind of as an interesting thing. Ukrainian information operations are actually like really good. They're way better than anything like the IDF does, just because they're actually in combat doing stuff, and what they show is actually like kind of cool. It highlights their equipment. It highlights, their tactical viability. And no one's saying they're not. Like, they have their best units out there in Kursk. But let me play this recent video from a Telegram channel real quick and kind of discuss what we're seeing. I'm going to describe it if you're listening to the audio. This is an important case study. So right now, they are in an MRAP, which is an American vehicle called a mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle. I hate them. They're really hard to get in and out of, but they're really sturdy. So right now they're doing a change of guard, or they're relieving men off the battlefield and kind of doing a resupply run in this one MRAP. They get hit by a drone. Let's look at it. So they stop. Because a lot of these vehicles are resistant to most like drone attacks, because they're heavily up armored American equipment built to resist like Iranian made IEDs during the unfortunately entitled Global War on Terror. Basically, the drones try to attack while they're doing a shift change. They're kicking ammo and bottles of water out, and you can see how difficult it is to get out of these goddamn vehicles. All right, and the fire team replaces the other fire team, and they start driving. And they were just hit by a drone munition. And you can see that this is nothing new. They're not really shocked at all. And the integrity of the vehicle is still intact, and there's no casualties. So this is kind of how Ukrainian information operations work. It shows like two successful operations, and it gets passed around the internet, but it's not indicative of what's actually happening on the ground. And that, I think that's important to point out, because a lot of the information that we get about like what Ukraine is doing, how they are behaving militarily, performing militarily, comes from Western think tanks, Western media, and pro-Ukraine Telegram channels. And I'm not saying like don't be pro-Ukrainian. This is like, from my perspective, it's totally strategic and tactical analysis. It's apolitical, but that's not how you determine what's actually going on in a battle space. So I just wanted to point that out for everybody as a case study.
No, I completely agree with you. I wanted to say something actually about the objective of targeting or trying to take over the territory where the nuclear power plants are in Kursk. And also there's also nuclear weapons facilities, from what I understand, in that area as well. my personal belief is, and this is also, I think, supported with the events that have just taken place in Zaporozhye as well, which is obviously within Ukraine, but is now Russian-controlled territory within Ukraine, the nuclear power plants within Ukraine. So the idea of taking over the nuclear power plants in Russia, in Kursk, as a sort of negotiating tool in order to improve their position on the negotiating table, like we said, it's not very feasible because Russia will be able to crack down on this very fast. So their ability to actually take control, long-standing control over this territory, I don't think is very feasible. My personal opinion is, and obviously again, this is just speculative, that I genuinely think they want to inflict damage to the nuclear power plant. And the reason for this is because, as you said, it's one of the 3 largest power plants in Russia that provides and provides energy for it's I think it's also one of the 4 major energy providers for the country. Any damage to this power plant will be absolutely an economic hit, a huge economic hit for Russia. And this is important because if we go back to a lot of the papers, like from the Rand Corporation, who published a paper in 2019 titled Extending Russia, one of the objectives behind, for example, using Ukraine as a means to weaken Russia, which was the purpose of that entire paper, is to inflict huge economic costs to Russia. This would be one of those mechanisms that were listed within the actual paper. And if you look at the paper itself, it says as one of the risk factors, it would probably cost the lives of many Ukrainians, and simultaneously, it would obviously be disadvantageous in terms of peace for the Ukrainians in the long run. But it would be a huge blow to the economy of Russia. Now, the reason I also say this is because at the same time, there was like a hit in Zaporozhye, and now Russia stating that the Ukrainians have done it. The Ukrainians are stating that the Russians have done it. I'm more personal of the belief that the Ukrainians would have most likely done it because they have more to gain from it than Russia does. Because if right now Russia controls the area of the Zaporozhye power plants, that, for example, is going to be kept within their territories. Any destruction to those nuclear power plants will obviously, again, it would actually affect Russia on the negotiating table. It will also affect Russia economically because they would have to be the ones to reinvest in restoring any sort of the economic implications and the energy implications and the infrastructure implications of a hit like that would have for the territories of eastern Ukraine that are now controlled by Russia. And so my personal belief when it comes to the idea behind some of these attacks is to try to inflict, beyond the PR campaign behind it, sort of the look that it's going to give, this artificial victory to boost the morale of Ukrainians, but also the image globally of the Ukrainian military. And of course, at the same time, to undermine Putin and to undermine Putin most predominantly in the eyes of Russians. I think one of the goals as well is to try to inflict damage. And this is, again, my personal opinion, inflict damage on these nuclear power plants in order to inflict a huge economic blow on Russia.
So if that's true, doesn't it seem like a bit risking Chernobyl 2.0 if you hit like a coolant reactor and it goes into meltdown?
It is, but we've seen things like that before. I mean, so far, look at what's happened so far with the Ukraine-Russian, since the start of the Ukraine-Russia sort of war, the invasion, special military operation, whatever you like to call it. We have seen the bombing and the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. I mean, this was considered the greatest terrorist attack on industrial infrastructure in history. Then we've seen, it's not the first time we've seen attacks on Zaporozhye consistently. And so for me, this isn't really surprising anymore. We have seen them make attempts to try to dismantle a key infrastructure that would be very dangerous. It is a vacuous move. I completely agree with you. It risks the lives of even Ukrainians at this point. But this is something we have seen, this sort of modus operandi take place now quite a bit in this particular conflict. And the reason that I allude to the fact that it's coming more from the Ukrainian side is because they have more to gain strategically from inflicting that kind of harm than Russia does right now. Russia does not need destructions to their energy sector that's going to affect their economy, that's going to undermine their military and their political establishment, which is what's even happening that's one of the goals right now as well of this whole incursion.
So a lot of the mainstream media is saying, and we're going to get into some think tank articles here in a second, that the Russian military is in disarray. They're trying to downplay it. That's highly debatable. It doesn't seem like it's, from a military perspective, it's anything to freak out about. This isn't the opening moves of a massive advantage or a massive invasion that's going to be decisive and turn the tide of a losing war. However, this idea of it being a bargaining chip is complicated by the fact that Putin has said publicly in the global forum that there will be no negotiations over this. Let me play you the video real quick. This is from 2 days ago.
They're trying to improve their negotiating positions in the future, but what negotiations could we even talk about with people who are attacking civilian infrastructure, or trying to create threats or nuclear industry facilities? What is there to even talk about with them of the Ukrainians? They're trying to improve their negotiating positions.
Okay. A bit hypocritical on the attacking civilian infrastructure, but he's not wrong about the trying to damage it, gain control of it. And he stated, regardless of what you think about Putin, that they don't seem to be open to allowing the Ukrainians to use these things as bargaining chips in future ceasefire or settlement negotiations.
Yeah, I think that's why I think this was a very ridiculous move, because up until even a few weeks ago, when they had the Ukrainian Peace Summit, I think was a few weeks ago. Oh God, time flies. Was it like a month ago now? I think I've lost track of time. The Ukrainian
everything's moving so fast and blending together. I believe it was June 16th and 17th. You're talking about the Swiss.
Oh, it was June already.
Yeah. You're talking about the Swiss.
Time flies,
the Swiss peace summit about the war in Ukraine, to which Russia was not even invited. Yes, that was a couple months ago.
Yeah, so right before that, I mean, again, he was basically saying that they're open to ceasefire talks. Now, of course, you accurately said in your intro, he said that, the Ukrainians have to consider the realities of the ground and the political situation, et cetera, et cetera. But Russia has constantly reiterated that they want a negotiated settlement, I think from the very beginning. And that's why they even tried to rush an agreement within the first few weeks of the war. And now with this, it's significantly going to harden Russia's approach. And something I feel like a lot of people in the West don't understand about Russian society and Russian culture, and I will say this from the knowledge that I have, is that moments like this harden the Russian people's stance more than one could imagine. That it's not been uncommon to hear from Russians that they do not believe they believe that Putin hasn't even been hard enough. This is something from Russian media, I think, not just from Russian media, as in from Russian society, that I've heard systematically over the years, by the way, not just now, over the years. So he would be expected, if anything now, to take an even more harsher stance. So the idea, the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's this idea that's propagated through the West that this is going to undermine him politically, it's going to aggravate people at home, and it's going to turn people against the war. That's the thing. In Russian society, it doesn't work like way. It might just go the complete other direction. And that's another reason why I think this move was even more ridiculous, because it's so tone deaf to the evaluation of Russian society. And this is the problem that I find sometimes with these Western analytics. They don't always understand the culture, the society that they're speaking about. They kind of speak about it from a very outdated Western
Cold War.
yeah, it doesn't work like that anymore. And I think that this is why there's so many miscalculations that are taking place. Societies in wherever, whether it's China, Russia, I don't know, Iran, whoever, they're analyzing it from a Western perspective and not from the Chinese perspective, not from the Russian perspective, based on their culture, their history, their temperament as a group of people. And so I can tell you that this will only harden now Putin's stance. And so again, this is what I'm saying. This move is not going to do anything for Ukraine in the long run. I just think
And
it's a huge blow for Ukraine in the future.
Yeah, and let me
Yeah.
expand on that a little bit. This kind of harkens back to the 2002 leaked memo, the WikiLeaks memo from
Yeah.
William Burns, who is now the current director of the CIA, trying to futilely broker negotiations between the Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire in Gaza. But he was writing back in 2010 saying that a NATO buildup essentially, this is when he was part of the State Department on the Russia desk. I think he was ambassador to Russia at the time.
Mm-hmm. He was the ambassador to Russia at the time.
Yeah,
I think it was
saying,
2008. I think it was 2007,
okay.
2008. It was something along those lines. Yeah.
Okay. So he was advising them about how about the Russians' existential anxiety about another foreign invader, like another foreign invasion, and that's what the people see NATO as. They see NATO as an expansionist imperial organism, and so when that's associated with Ukraine, and now Ukraine is now invading in what looks like a coordinated NATO operation, using NATO equipment, using NATO munitions, using NATO intelligence, because obviously NATO knew about this. It's only going to harden them further, because again, this plays on very real, long-standing existential anxieties that go back to like Napoleon, the Second World War. So yes, when you say that it's going to harden, it's definitely going to harden the people. And I think it's an interesting move that, the Russian state apparatus does have the ability to really rile people up over this, but they're not doing that.
Oh no, that's very true, because they don't want to rile the population up. It would put a lot of pressure on the state, because a lot of people don't see it like this in the West, but I actually find Putin to be quite measured for the most part. If you kind of calculate what's been happening, I would say from 2008 onwards, especially 2010 and following 2014 especially, there've been multiple provocations that in Russia, if you were watching what was happening in the conversations that were happening in Russia, so shooting down of planes, Russian planes, etc., this was aggravating the Russian public significantly. And the level of frustration towards Putin for not doing anything in response then was it was a lot. He was considered to be weak, that he wasn't defending Russia's sovereignty, that he wasn't the leader that Russia needed. So and all because he was taking a relatively more measured response over the years in order to avoid a war, or also to create the right circumstances by which you could actually defend the territory of Russia without actually doing so at the beck and call of the West that would have actually economically destroyed Russia. Because something that always gets missed as well is that the reason why Russia's economy is doing so well now is because Putin spent a good 8 years building the economy following 2014, specifically to be able to withhold against the implications and impacts of economic sanctions. So, for example, they became very self-sufficient in things like agricultural farming, etc., and they became sort of like a wheat-producing powerhouse that before 2014 wasn't the case. So, I mean, everything that Russia did from 2014 onwards was to prepare itself to become very economically self-sufficient. And so a lot of people in Russia were very impatient, to be honest. So again, this is the thing. This is what people don't understand in the West. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of frustrations there. Russian society and culture it's not the way people understand it. And so believe it or not, given the circumstances, Putin is actually rather measured in his responses.
So that is certainly not the interpretation from some political think tanks in the West, like the Rand Corporation or the Atlantic Council. And we were talking before the episode that I have a massive beef with the Atlantic Council, just because when we were preparing to go to Syria in 2013 during the Syrian Civil War. When I was still in Ranger Regiment, I was having to consume a lot of briefs associated with the Atlantic Council. And let's just say they turned out to be problematic, to say the least, about the Syrian Civil War. And we'll just leave it at that. That's so beyond the scope of this conversation. But I wanted to talk about the measured response, because this is how the same think tank, and when I say think tank, I mean the Atlantic Council is very much a cutout for Western intelligence. And the CIA is a bunch of former generals, a bunch of former intelligence officers that now work for the Rand Corporation. And of course, you don't just leave the company. They still have ties to it. So let's look at this one article put out recently, right after this. It's called Ukraine's Invasion of Russia, Erasing Vladimir Putin's Last Red Lines. As you guys know, a red line is, if you cross it, there's going to be a massive response. There hasn't been a massive response in the week from Russia, a week after the invasion began. And so basically the last 4 paragraphs of this article are worth looking at. So basically we're looking at something that is trying to manufacture consent. And when we've done an episode about think tanks, how politicians and decision makers in Western governments can't afford to be policy experts or regional experts or military experts, and they need to approve packages, make decision, put forward legislature. And so they look to think tanks to advise them on positions. So this is these kind of articles written by the Eurasian Center of the Atlantic Council are meant for policymakers, political operatives, senior military personnel, and people within the political and sometimes corporate class. So here we go, quoting from this Atlantic Council article that was just put out. It's very telling about a certain narrative that's trying to be pushed about this invasion. So, quote, ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began in February 2002, the international response has been hindered by fear of escalation. Western leaders have allowed themselves to be intimidated by Putin, who has used thinly veiled nuclear threats and frequent talk of Russian red lines to restrict the flow of military aid and convince Ukraine's partners to impose absurd restrictions on the use of Western weapons inside Russia. As a result, Ukraine has effectively been forced to wage war with one hand tied behind its back. So now they're trying to this is a very hawkish approach. They're saying, don't be intimidated by Putin. This is not a measured response. He's bluffing. He's weak. Now they go into pushing a certain policy. Ukraine's offensive is now posing serious questions about the credibility of Russia's saber rattling and the rationality behind the West's abundance of caution. After all, the Ukrainian army's current invasion of Russia is surely the reddest of all red lines. If Russia was in all seriousness about a possible nuclear escalation, this would be the moment to make good on many threats. Putin has responded by seeking to downplay the invasion. Again, we've established that it's worth downplaying, while pretending that everything is still going according to plan. It's just
here.
Yeah.
They keep reiterating this, but it's just a small thing. They keep reiterating this point that Putin has threatened nuclear escalation. That's really not the case. He's constantly he's not ever threatened nuclear escalation. What the statements that he's made over the last couple of years is actually that he is concerned more so about the West's arming of Ukraine and some of their tactical approaches, but why he's never really made these statements. So I don't understand like some of the comments that they come up with. Like I don't think he would. I just, it makes no sense to me. But yeah, sorry, just please continue.
Okay, and so no, just the last paragraph that kind of speaks to exactly what you just elaborated on about how a lot of these Western analyses are completely detached from the culture and the societal context of Russia. So it says here, Russian propagandists have adopted an equally low-key approach. There have been no appeals to the Russian people or attempts to rally the country against the invader. So we've already addressed that. these are definitely not the actions of a self-confident military superpower on the verge of a major escalation. I'm not sure what the point of this article is beyond telling Western policymakers to escalate and continue to fund the war in Ukraine without restrictions.
It's just a propaganda piece because honestly, okay, first of all, it comes off as very war hawkish because it's advocating for what exactly? Is Russia supposed to advocate to their own public like this is a dire threat to their existence and rile up the public, which doesn't need much in Russia, I'll tell you that much. And then what? For what? For an incursion into Kursk that most likely will be under control? Why? I don't understand. There's no rationality. The Russian approach, I think, is the most rational approach right now. This is nothing to be at this particular point in time so concerned about. It will come under control because of the basic military logistics of it. So there's really no reason to rile up the public, but yet they're trying to present Russia's measured approach in dealing with it in a sort of non-sensationalist way as them coming across as not having the confidence requisites and that it shows military weakness. It makes no this is the thing. So it does two things here. It's a propaganda piece to undermine, yet again, as they always do, Russia's military capabilities, but then also Putin and his leadership and his government in order to, give this artificial victory to Ukraine. But then at the same time, what exactly is it proposing? That Russia's supposed to aggravate the entire public and say this was a mass defeat or a mass threat to a country that everybody mobilized? I really don't understand the logic behind this article at all.
I kind of gravitate towards the last line where it said essentially, this is not the actions of a confident military superpower on the verge of escalation. The idea of a confident military superpower. Well, there are certain realities that these generally pro-West consent manufacturing publications have to recognize to even like maintain their journalistic integrity. And something we have to talk about is not just in terms of production capacity and the recruitment that Russia is capable of and has been proven to be capable of over the past 2 years, but there's the whole economic aspect, which is worth touching on as we draw towards the end. So The Economist, generally anti-Russian, is starting to that has for the past 2 years consistently put out articles saying like the Russian economy on the verge of collapse, the ruble is plummeting, they cannot sustain a war of attrition, they have the gross domestic product of New Jersey or California or like just a single state in the United States. Well, now 2 days ago, they just had to put this out. So this is under the subsection finance and economics, specifically war finance. Vladimir Putin spends big and sends Russia's economy soaring. How long can the party last? But the opening paragraph is, across the world, worries are mounting about the economy. In America and Canada, unemployment is rising while customer sentiment remains depressed. Europe continues to flirt with recession. Despite fierce sanctions and pariah status, Russia's economy is growing rapidly. It turns out the bacchanalian spending, I can't believe they use that word, at a time of war really juices an economy. So according to the Economist analysis, Russian GDP is expected to rise by over 3% in real terms, faster than 95% of rich countries. I believe the World Bank, was it the World Bank, just considered them to be a high-income country?
High-income country. It went from low to high-income country in the space of 2 years. Yeah.
So Russians are feeling good about the economy. And so this idea of internal pressure, that this idea of a continued war of attrition will breed political disunity. And of course, the Russian people aren't a monolith. I lived in India with Russian expats who absolutely hated Putin, and there's people inside the country who do as well. Not a monolith, but guess what? An uprising and a coup attempt is not going to happen when the economy is on an upturn, unemployment is at a historically low period during wartime. So, yeah.
this is what I keep trying to tell people. Okay, this is what I keep trying to tell people. So when you look at even Western polls, right? Every time they have a Western poll in Russia asking for looking at the general approval ratings of Putin, he always has a pretty high approval rating, around 80%. And people don't understand why, et cetera, et cetera. I always answer very simply. You have to look at his economic policies of the last 10 years. If you're the average Russian person, their quality of life in the last 10 years, because of his recent economic policies, have drastically improved. And in the irony behind that is that it was in response to Western sanctions. So when the United States began sanctioning Russia in 2014, obviously following the annexation of Crimea, Russia at that point in time, and I earlier in this podcast, I had referenced specifically the agricultural sector and the farming sector and the wheat production, et cetera. They had no such industry at all. And actually it was following the sanctions. Because of the sanctions, they weren't able to import particular production, particularly in agriculture. So Putin actually invested heavily in different sectors of the economy in order to basically become self-sufficient. And in doing so, it actually generated not only self-sufficiency, but also a lot of wealth. And within the space of just a couple of years, as I've said before, they became a grain exporting powerhouse, which now the world became very dependent on, including fertilizers. This was not the case before 2014. And so when you're the basic average Russian person, working class person, who is basically being given all these sort of government grants, etc., and you're able to open new industries, and they're basically encouraging different sectors in Russia to prosper, you're going to vote based on that, including, of course, one of the other existential crises that the Russian average person is in, which is obviously their national security, which to them he does seem to protect. So like when a lot of people ask me this question, I always answer, the reason he does have approval from a majority of the population of Russia does stem from these facts. He has helped the economy significantly, and this was even before the Ukraine-Russian war. And he does provide he has met, at least now, the national security concerns of a lot of them. This is not to say that Putin is perfect, because, for example, there's a lot of other things that you could get into, but this is where he gets a lot of his approval from, which is the economic realities of Russia.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of people are willing to overlook his authoritarian leanings if, they're able to survive and they're economically stable. So I don't think the coup. The revolution that people were talking about 2 years ago at the start of this war, it's just not gonna happen.
No, I don't. Listen, Russia's going to go, like I've said, I think we've had this conversation in private. Russia's going through its own changes, which I find very interesting. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I mean, Putin has gone from being some of his statements, even until recently, he's been very anti-left, anti-communist, anti-anything, socialist, but yet his alignment with China has changed his internal economic policies and the way he approaches now the sort of the managing of let's just say the economic managing of the country, which is looking more socialist than it has in years. And he's now, and I remember there's this one economist who I find, she's one of my personal favorites. Her name is Radhika Desai. She's actually an economist based in Canada. And she was actually stating that when she had visited Russia for the Valdai conference, which is a conference of intellectuals that meet to discuss economics, etc., she was basically stating that she was surprised that a lot of the people that were advising government now were coming from much more socialist left-wing backgrounds, which several years ago would be completely out of the question. So Russia's going through its own changes, and it will happen organically. Any sort of movement is going to happen organically within that society to meet the demands of that society. And I think that's also something that a lot of Westerners don't understand. We can't impose change on any particular country. Change will happen organically within the needs to meet the needs of the particular country, people, culture, and economy. So at the moment, Putin is working for them. However, it's not going to be the same in the long run. Things will evolve and change.
Yeah. But in the short term, circling back as we
Sorry.
round out, no, this has been a great. I mean, you can't separate economics from war. But going back to this Ukrainian operation for the last 5 minutes, the likely goals of the incursion, the likely strategic goals of the incursion aren't gonna happen. The one. To stall the Russian initiative and territorial gains it has made since the start of 2024. Yeah, some Russian military units, some combat units, and some reserve units have been rerouted to do this. It will affect what's happening in the Donetsk region. It will halt some of the territorial progress temporarily. So there you go. Then the war of attrition will continue. Two, to win a much needed public relations victory and focus on a more positive narrative for Ukraine. I think we both stated that that will be short lived. I don't think it will survive more than 2 weeks. And the MEMAC, the military industrial media and academic complex, will continue to try to manufacture consent for more aid, because what I think we're going to see is you see what Ukrainian Army did with all these Strikers and these Bradleys and these United States MRAPs. We sent them, and they're getting F-16s from Denmark, and they've established air superiority over a tiny region for a little bit. We need to send them more aid. And so I think we're going to see that, but that I think will die away again because the victory is not sustainable. The third objective was to capture and hold as much territory as militarily viable to use as bargaining chips. I don't think they can hold it until the peace talks begin, so they won't have it as bargaining chips. And plus Putin said that he wouldn't allow them to use it as a bargaining chip, and I don't know, to improve its leverage with the European Union. What is going on? I think in summation, in conclusion, it's going to end up being a big nothing burger whiff of an operation that's going to be damaging in the long run.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's going to do anything. I think it's going to be very short-lived, and in the end, they would have lost good troops, weapons, ammunition, etc., and might strategically, they'll probably lose ground in the Donbass anyway, which is something that they didn't want. So ultimately, what did you accomplish in this situation? Nothing, other than just a nice little PR stunt for Atlantic Council, your favorite, to write a little article about, so that you and I can sit here and discuss it for a little bit, and then in some time from now, it will probably just be worse for them in the long run. And as we said, it's not even going to really undermine Putin locally. It's just going to harden the situation even further. So I just don't see it doing anything. Yeah.
One talking point that we're hearing from Western politicians that I'd like to hear you address before we end is Ukraine. This operation, Ukraine has a right to defend itself against Russia. How, if Russia invaded Ukraine, is it an escalation for Ukraine to invade Russia?
Sorry, repeat that question. Is it an escalation for Ukraine to invade Russia?
Yeah, that's the question. If Russia invaded Ukraine and Ukraine has a right to defend its sovereignty, how is it an escalation for Ukraine to invade Russia? That's the main talking point that's being put out by politicians right now.
Oh, how is it an escalation?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, it is an escalation from I don't know. I just don't even view it as an escalation, honestly. So it's very, I see that I don't know how to answer that question, honestly, because I don't see it as in any way, shape, or form a form of escalation. Are you saying that basically that the logic right now is that the West is putting forward is that it classifies as an escalation, if I've understood your question correctly? that there's
Well,
things to
see,
justify
I
the
mean,
escalation?
it's yeah, I mean, how they're saying that it's actually not an escalation, but
Oh,
there's
that. Oh, yeah,
conflicting.
yeah. Well, it's not an escalation. It's not
Yeah,
an escalation, but it's just no. It's not an escalation, and I think Russia views it as not as particularly an escalation, but it is. It's crossed a red line, uh, as he said, essentially because it's targeting nuclear power plants, civilian infrastructures, and for them, they're going to be classifying as a form of act of terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't really change anything, and I think Russia views it in the same way. I think Ukrainians view it in the same way, and I think the West understands that as well. And like I said, it's not the first time that this has happened anyway. We've seen it happen multiple times up to this point with in Belgrade. But at that point, it wasn't claimed by the Ukrainian state, even though it was actually by the Ukrainian state. Because at that time as well, we have to also remember that the conditions for the weapons that were being given to Ukraine were that they will only be used in defensive purposes and not offensive, specifically to target within Russia, right? So at that time, it was to actually state that it was the Ukrainian state that had orchestrated the attacks on Belgrade would have obviously violated supposedly the terms of the condition. So by blaming it on a militia, it was sort of allowing for plausible deniability in the future. But now, I mean, we all kind of recall that Western states have sort of backtracked a bit on those particular statements of allowing Ukraine to use, or how they allow Ukraine to use the weapons sent to them, which would include attacking in Russia. So it's not particularly new. It doesn't mark a great escalation. Yeah, but I think we can all agree to that, to be honest with you.
yeah. All right, and it's just not going to work out. So I think we might do another episode on this, but I think it's just going to sort itself out, and the status quo will be reestablished unless they try something really crazy, which will warrant another episode. But I think we can shut the book on this one for the time being. Personally, it's just nothing new to see here.
No,
Yeah.
I don't really think it's going to change anything at all. That's why I didn't even pay too much attention to it. Like when it came out, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's happening. And everybody was discussing it extensively. I was like, yeah, nothing's going to come of this. That was my initial reaction. And that hasn't really changed since, even looking into the more extensive details.
All right, y'all. Well, we'll see if we're right. I think we're right. And thank you all so much for listening. I think we're going to be doing our next episode on the upcoming DNC protests, fragmentation of people in the left fighting over like Kamala Harris, different candidates, and how that's bad. Also, infiltration at protests, because there's going to be more infiltration at the DNC protest. And just talking about that upcoming action. And so stay tuned for that one. Thank you, Elena, for coming on to talk about this, and we will see y'all next time.